close your eyes and imagine a world 4,000 years old. A world of mud brick cities, flooding rivers and gods who supposedly did nothing for themselves. In ancient Sumer, the gods were mighty, immortal, terrifying. They controlled the storms, the harvests, the very fate of kings. But according to their own clay tablets, there were things these gods absolutely could not do. Things only human hands, human backs, human suffering could accomplish. That's the strange, almost unbelievable claim buried in cuneiform texts, thousands of years old. And tonight, we're going through 11 of them, one by one, slowly, carefully, the way the Sumerians themselves might have told it around a dying fire. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there? I check the comments constantly, and it's wild to see Tokyo at sunrise, Toronto at midnight, London somewhere in between, all drifting off to the same ancient story. It never gets old. Now here's the thing about these tablets. The Sumerians weren't writing fantasy for entertainment. They believed this. They believed the gods were real, powerful, and utterly dependent on something they themselves lacked: human labour, human endurance, human hands willing to dig, plant, build, and suffer. It's a strange kind of theology, one where mortals aren't just servants of the divine, they're necessary. Without humans, the gods' world simply falls apart. Before we go further, if you enjoy these long, slow, historical deep dives, the best way to support the show is by following on Spotify, listening there, and if you enjoy it, leaving a 5-star review. The link is right in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Also, if mysteries like this fascinate you, I've put together a book covering 12 unexplained historical mysteries, available on the website, links in the description too. Now, let's step back into the dust and clay of ancient Mesopotamia and uncover the very first thing the gods needed humans to do. Let's begin with entry number 1 on this strange list: farming the gods' fields. And to understand why this one tops the tablets, we have to go back even further than Sumer's cities, back to a time the priests themselves considered mythic, a time before humans existed at all. Because according to the oldest Mesopotamian creation stories, there was a version of the world where humans weren't needed yet. And in that world, it was the gods themselves who had to do the digging. Picture it. No cities, no rivers tamed by canals, just gods, the great ones and the lesser ones, living in a kind of cosmic hierarchy where rank determined labour. The senior gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki, sat at the top, giving orders, shaping fate, deciding the course of rivers and seasons. But beneath them were the lesser gods, sometimes called the Anunnaki in later texts, and it was these lower-ranking divine beings who were stuck doing the actual work, digging canals, hauling baskets of earth, clearing riverbeds so the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates could flow the way the senior gods demanded. It's a strange image, isn't it? Gods with blistered hands, gods complaining about their backs, gods forced into generations of hard labour because someone above them decided the world needed shaping, and they were the ones stuck holding the shovel. According to the Atrahasis myth, one of the oldest and most detailed accounts we have, this arrangement didn't last. The lesser gods grew tired, not tired in some poetic, symbolic way, but exhausted in a very real, physical sense. The texts describe them working for decades. Some versions say centuries, digging out the courses of rivers, piling up mountains of silt, labouring under the sun, while the senior gods lived in comfort above them. And eventually, they broke. They set down their tools. They marched to the gates of Enlil's temple in the dead of night and set fire to their work implements as a form of protest. It's one of the earliest recorded labour uprisings in human storytelling, except the labourers weren't human at all. This is where things get genuinely strange, and where the tablets start revealing something almost philosophical about how the Sumerians understood the universe. Because when the senior gods woke to find their labour force in open revolt, they didn't simply punish them. They realised something. The system itself was flawed. You cannot have a divine order where the highest beings expect endless toil from the ones just beneath them without eventually reaching a breaking point. Something had to change. Someone else had to bear this burden. Enter Enki, the god of wisdom, freshwater, and cunning, a deity who shows up again and again throughout Sumerian and later Babylonian tradition as the clever fixer of impossible situations. According to the myth, Enki proposed a solution to the assembled gods. Instead of forcing the lesser gods to continue their endless labour, why not create an entirely new kind of being? One whose sole purpose would be to take over the digging, the farming, the endless physical maintenance of the world, a being lower than the gods, but capable of doing everything the gods no longer wished to do themselves. And so, according to these ancient accounts, humanity was born not out of love, not out of some grand cosmic purpose, but out of divine exhaustion. We were, in the eyes of the Sumerians, essentially a labour solution, a workaround, a species engineered quite literally in the myths, from clay and the blood of a slain god mixed together by the mother goddess Nintu, sometimes called Ninhursag, at Enki's request. The clay gave us our earthly nature, our connection to soil and river mud. The divine blood gave us just enough of the god's essence to carry intelligence, to understand instruction, to be capable of the same work the gods themselves had once performed. Now, it's worth pausing here to acknowledge something important. We're not claiming this is literal history, and neither should you take it that way. What we're looking at is a religious tradition, a way that Bronze Age Mesopotamians explained their world, their labour, their relationship to forces they couldn't control, the flooding rivers, the harsh sun, the unpredictable harvests. Whether you view these myths as sacred truth, as ancient metaphor, or simply as a fascinating glimpse into how early civilization understood its place in the cosmos, is entirely up to you. But what's undeniable is how seriously the Sumerians took this framework. This wasn't campfire fiction to them. This was theology. This was the explanation for why humans existed at all, why we toiled beneath the sun, while divine beings looked down from temples built to house their images. And this belief shaped everything about how Sumerian society functioned. If humans existed specifically to relieve the gods of labour, then labour itself became sacred. Farming wasn't just about survival, it was about fulfilling a cosmic contract. Every field ploughed, every canal maintained, was in some sense a continuation of that original bargain struck between Enki and the assembly of gods. Humans had been created for this. It was quite literally our reason for being. Think about what that means for a farmer standing in a field along the Euphrates 4,000 years ago. He's not just growing barley to feed his family. In his mind, in the belief system surrounding him since birth, he's performing a task that gods once did themselves and grew too exhausted to continue. He's part of an ancient chain of labour stretching back before the world was even fully formed. That's a heavy thing to carry into a wheat field at dawn. And yet it's exactly the framework tablet after tablet describes when explaining why humanity toils the way it does. But knowing why the gods needed us to farm is only half the story. The tablets go much further, describing exactly how this divine labour arrangement played out once humans actually took up the tools the gods had set down. What did that work actually look like? Start with the crop that made southern Mesopotamia possible in the first place. Barley, not wheat at least, not as the dominant grain in the deep south. Wheat struggled in the salty soils of the alluvial plain, especially as centuries of irrigation gradually pulled salts toward the surface. But barley was tougher. It could tolerate conditions that would kill more delicate crops. It was the grain of bread, beer, animal feed, wages, offerings, and survival. And growing it was not a single act. It was a chain of acts, each one dependent on the last, each one timed to a landscape that could be generous one year and brutal the next. First came the clearing. Fields had to be rid of weeds, old stalks, and whatever the last flood had left behind. Then came the breaking of the soil with the plough. Early Mesopotamian farmers used animal-drawn ploughs, often pulled by oxen, cutting shallow furrows through the earth. Later tools could even drop seed as they moved, combining ploughing and sowing in one efficient process. It sounds simple. Put seeds in soil, wait for grain. But nothing about farming in Sumer was simple. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates was not naturally a green paradise. It was a vast, flat floodplain, hot for much of the year, dry beyond imagination when the rivers failed to reach a field. The rain that fell was rarely enough to support reliable agriculture. So a farmer had to understand soil, water, seasons, animals, seed stock, and the moods of the river. He had to know when the ground held enough moisture, when the wind would dry young shoots, when a field was becoming too salty, when birds or grazing animals might destroy a crop before it had properly emerged. This is one reason grain became almost sacred in Mesopotamian thought. Not because a stalk of barley was magical by itself, but because it represented the difference between order and collapse. A field of ripe barley meant bread could be baked, beer could be brewed, workers could receive rations, temples could make offerings, families could survive another year. An empty field meant all of that began to unravel. Sumerian texts preserve this deep fascination with cultivation. There are hymns praising abundance, administrative tablets recording grain measured in astonishing quantities, and literary debates where plants and farming tools are given voices and personality. In one famous Sumerian debate poem, grain and sheep argue over which of them is more valuable to humanity. It sounds almost playful, two necessities competing for bragging rights. But underneath the humour is a serious question. What keeps civilization alive? The answer, of course, is both. Yet grain occupies a special place because it can be stored, counted, redistributed, and turned into the basic fuel of an entire city. And that counting mattered. Mesopotamian officials measured grain with obsessive care. They recorded deliveries, seed allocations, harvest shares, rations for workers, beer ingredients, and offerings for temples. Thousands of clay tablets survive because grain was not merely food. It was wealth in a form everyone could understand. A person might receive barley instead of coins. A labourer could be paid in grain. A household security might be calculated in how much grain sat in storage jars after the harvest. Imagine the pressure of that harvest season. The barley had to be cut at the right moment before wind, rain, pests or theft could take it. Workers moved through the fields with sickles, slicing stalks close to the ground. The crop was gathered into bundles, carried to threshing floors, and beaten or trampled so the edible grain separated from the stalk. Then came winnowing. Grain was tossed into moving air, allowing the lighter chaff to blow aside while the heavy kernels fell back down. It was repetitive, dusty, back-breaking, and it had to be done again and again, year after year, generation after generation. This is where the Sumerian religious contrast becomes so revealing. The claim is not really that a god was physically incapable of touching soil or holding a tool. Ancient myths often show gods doing all kinds of human-like things. The deeper idea is that the ongoing burden of cultivation belonged to humanity. Humans could do this in the way the divine order expected them to do it, patiently, seasonally, endlessly, turning mud, seed, sweat and water into the provisions that sustained both people and temples. The gods received the finished result. Humans endured the process, and perhaps that is why farming carried such enormous dignity alongside such enormous hardship. A farmer was close to the most basic purpose of society. Without cultivators there was no surplus. Without surplus, no scribes keeping records, no builders raising temples, no merchants moving goods, no rulers commanding armies, no great cities glowing above the plain. Every polished palace wall and every carefully impressed tablet depended, at the bottom of the chain, on someone standing ankle-deep in earth and trying to make barley grow. If you enjoy these strange connections between ancient mysteries, religion and the forgotten realities behind civilization, there's a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description now. There is an uncomfortable modern temptation to imagine ancient farmers as isolated peasants, each working a tiny family plot in peaceful independence. But Sumerian agriculture was often much more organized than that. Large temple and palace institutions controlled extensive lands. They assigned work crews, tracked seed, counted livestock, and collected harvests. Some people worked their own plots, others laboured on institutional fields. Many probably did both, balancing family survival with obligations to larger authorities. The tablets can make this world feel strangely familiar. They list workers who failed to appear. They record shortages. They complain about missing tools and delayed deliveries. They track rations with the same anxious precision that a modern office tracks payroll. Civilization, it turns out, did not begin with philosophers asking what it means to exist. It began, at least in part, with someone asking where the grain went. But even the best seed and the strongest workers were helpless without one thing: water in the right place at the right time. The rivers gave Mesopotamia life, but they did not give it gently. Their floods came when fields did not always need them. Their waters could nourish a crop or destroy it. To turn that uncertainty into a stable harvest, humans had to reshape the landscape itself. And that meant taking up another task the gods, in these ancient stories, were all too happy to leave behind. Number 2. Digging life-giving canals. If farming was the foundation of Sumerian life, irrigation was the hidden machinery beneath it. Barley could survive difficult soil. Farmers could plough, sow, weed and harvest with astonishing discipline. But none of it mattered if water failed to reach the field. Southern Mesopotamia had 2 great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, but it did not have dependable rain. That sounds almost impossible at first. How can a land sitting between 2 enormous rivers be dry? But rivers do not water every field simply by existing nearby. A river follows its own channel. It rises and falls according to rains and snowmelt far upstream. It may flood violently in one place while leaving land only a few miles away, cracked and thirsty. And the timing was a problem. In southern Mesopotamia, the rivers often rose most strongly in spring, while the critical growing season for winter barley had its own rhythm. Water might arrive too late, too early, too much, or not enough. A flood could rip through a field, burying young plants beneath mud. A dry spell could leave seedlings dead before they had a chance. The river was life, but life in its wild form. To build cities, people had to make that life predictable. So they redirected it. They cut channels through the flat plain, drawing water away from the rivers and carrying it toward fields that would otherwise produce almost nothing. From major canals came smaller branches. From smaller branches came ditches leading toward individual plots. Gates, embankments, and raised banks helped manage the flow. Water could be admitted, slowed, divided, or blocked, at least in theory. The landscape became something like a vast artificial river system, spread across the plain by human planning and human muscle. Picture the difference this made. Without irrigation, southern Iraq was capable of supporting scattered communities near natural water sources. With irrigation, the same land could produce broad fields of barley, dates, vegetables, flax, and fodder for animals. A settlement could feed not only farmers, but potters, weavers, boatmen, scribes, priests, metalworkers, guards, officials, and rulers. It could store surplus. It could survive bad seasons better than a village living from one harvest to the next. It could become a city. That is why canals were never just ditches. A canal was food. It was tax revenue. It was temple offerings. It was beer in a worker's ration bowl. It was clay tablets filled with grain accounts. It was the reason a priest could stand before a god's statue with bread and incense, and the reason a king could claim that he had brought prosperity to his people. When Mesopotamian rulers praised themselves in inscriptions, they often spoke about digging canals, restoring waterways, bringing abundance to fields, and making neglected land fertile again. This was not decorative language. In a world built on irrigation, controlling water was one of the clearest signs that a ruler could create order from danger. And that word order matters. The Sumerians did not see the world as a neat machine that operated automatically. The universe could slip toward disorder. Floods came. Droughts came. Reeds swallowed abandoned channels. Sand and silt changed the course of water. Fields became salty. A city that lost access to water could weaken with terrifying speed. Irrigation was humanity's answer to that uncertainty. Not a perfect answer, not a permanent victory, but a daily act of resistance against the dry land and the unpredictable river. There is a strange irony here. Mesopotamia is sometimes called the cradle of civilization because of its fertile land. But fertility was not simply waiting there, ready to be collected. Much of it had to be manufactured. Humans made the plain productive by moving water where nature had not placed it. They turned a difficult floodplain into an agricultural engine. That may be one of the most important things humans could do in the Sumerian religious imagination. The gods could command storms, they could send floods. They could hold authority over the cosmic forces that made life possible. But the patient, exhausting conversion of river water into a reliable crop belonged to people. The divine world received bread, beer, meat, and incense at the temple. Human beings stood in the mud and made sure the water reached the barley first. Ancient Mesopotamian literature preserves this contrast in different forms. In the Atrahasis myth, the lesser gods grow tired of digging canals and doing agricultural labour for the great gods. Their complaint becomes so serious that the gods create humans to take over the burden. The story is myth, not an irrigation manual, and its versions come from later Akkadian tradition rather than the earliest Sumerian tablets alone. But it reflects a Mesopotamian idea that reaches deep into the region's culture. Canal work was necessary work, foundational work, the kind of work someone had to do if gods and cities were going to be fed. And it was never enough simply to dig once. Water has its own ideas. It carries silt, it eats away at banks, it overflows when channels are too full and disappears when channels are blocked. A canal that brought abundance in one season could become a stagnant obstacle in the next. Too little water meant hunger. Too much water could drown crops or wash away precious soil. Worse still, irrigation carried a slow danger that farmers could not always see immediately. Salt, when water spread across hot fields and then evaporated under the Mesopotamian sun, it left mineral salts behind. Over generations, especially where drainage was poor, those salts could build up in the soil. Land that once produced wheat might become better suited to hardier barley. Land that produced barley might eventually yield less and less. The people of Sumer were not ignorant of this. Their crop records show shifts in cultivation over time, and scholars see evidence that salinization became a serious long-term challenge in parts of the south. Irrigation made civilization possible, but it also created problems that civilization had to keep solving. If you enjoy these ancient puzzles, where the same invention can be both a miracle and a burden, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. The canal system also changed how people understood distance. Waterways became roads as much as they were irrigation works. Boats could move grain, reeds, clay, timber, fish, people and messages between settlements. On a flat landscape with few natural building materials, canals connected communities to resources from far away. A city could import wood from the north or east, stone from distant lands, metals through trade networks, and still send out its own grain and woven goods in return. Even the cities themselves were shaped by water. Uruk, Lagash, Nippur, and many other settlements existed within networks of rivers, branches, marshes, canals, and basins that shifted over centuries. The exact courses changed. Some ancient waterways are now dry. Some cities that were once connected to busy channels sit far from modern rivers. But in their own time, water linked the world together. This is why a canal could be an object of pride, fear, prayer, and conflict all at once. Whoever controlled water controlled harvests. Whoever controlled harvests could support workers, temples, armies, and households. A damaged canal was not merely an inconvenience, it could become a threat to the entire social order, and keeping that water moving required far more than one farmer with a shovel. It required organised labour on a scale that could not be improvised at the last minute. A small ditch beside one family's plot could be cleared by that family. But a major canal running for miles across the plain was another thing entirely. Its banks had to be inspected. Its bed had to be dredged. Reeds had to be cut back before they choked the flow. Silt had to be scraped out and hauled away. Breaks in the embankment had to be packed with mud, baskets of earth, reeds, and whatever else could hold against the pressure of moving water. Gates and openings had to be watched. Smaller channels had to be opened for some fields and closed for others. And every one of these tasks had to happen at the right time. Because if you waited until the canal was completely blocked, you had already lost. Imagine the work crew arriving before the heat becomes unbearable. Not a few men wandering out with casual tools, but a labour gang. Workers carrying hoes, digging sticks, baskets, and perhaps wooden implements, strengthened with metal where such tools were available. They climbed down into a channel baked hard at the edges and slick with mud at the bottom. They cut through tangled reeds. They loosen heavy wet silt. They load it into baskets. Then they carry those baskets up the bank again and again, emptying them where the spoil will not simply wash straight back into the canal during the next rise of water. It is difficult, repetitive, unglamorous work. The kind of work that leaves mud in your hands, your clothes, your food, and probably your dreams. And it was seasonal. Canals needed attention before water was released. They needed emergency repairs during floods. They needed clearing after floods had deposited new layers of sediment. They needed constant local adjustments as channels shifted, banks weakened, and neighbouring fields demanded their share. A great irrigation system was never truly finished. It was a living construction that had to be rebuilt piece by piece every year. This is where the Sumerian world becomes startlingly modern. We often picture ancient cities as temples, kings, monuments, and mysterious writing on clay tablets. But beneath all of that was administration. Somebody had to decide who worked. Somebody had to record how long they worked. Somebody had to distribute rations. Somebody had to inspect whether a crew had actually cleared the assigned section, rather than spending half the day sitting in the shade beside a reed bed. The tablets preserve glimpses of this vast practical system. Not always dramatic stories, not heroic speeches, but lists. Names, measures of grain, amounts of beer, teams of workers, fields, canals, dates. To us, an accounting tablet can look almost boring. But read it another way. It is evidence of people coordinating hundreds, perhaps thousands of human bodies to keep a landscape alive. A worker might receive a daily ration of barley, sometimes oil, wool or beer, depending on the period and institution. Labour could be organised through temples, palaces, households or local authorities. The details changed across the long history of Mesopotamia, and we should be careful not to imagine one identical system lasting forever. Sumer was not a single frozen civilization. Its cities competed, changed rulers, changed languages, and developed new institutions. But the basic reality endured. Large-scale water management required groups of people working under organized direction, and those groups could be large. Think about a canal bank collapsing during a high flow. Water begins cutting through a weak point. At first it is only a narrow stream spilling where it should not. Then the current tears away more mud. The gap widens. Water rushes into fields, across paths, toward homes, perhaps toward another channel that is not prepared to receive it. This is not the moment for one farmer to make a personal decision about his afternoon schedule. A warning has to travel. Workers have to be gathered. Tools and earth have to arrive. People have to stand in mud and moving water, building a barrier fast enough to stop something stronger than any one of them. That is collective labour in its most literal form. Many hands against the river. The Sumerians understood that canals also created obligations between neighbours. Water did not politely respect property lines. If someone neglected a section of bank, the damage could spread downstream. If someone diverted too much water, another field could suffer. If a local official favoured one household over another, resentment could grow as quickly as reeds in a neglected ditch. Later Mesopotamian law codes, including the famous laws associated with Hammurabi, show how seriously canal negligence could be treated. Those laws belong to a later Babylonian world, not the earliest Sumerian city-states, but they preserve a regional legal tradition shaped by the same problem. If a man failed to maintain his dike and caused flooding that ruined another person's field, he could be held responsible for the loss. The principle is simple enough to understand even now. Water infrastructure is shared infrastructure. Ignore your part, and everyone may pay. That shared danger gave rulers an enormous role. Kings liked to present themselves as restorers of canals, builders of embankments, and bringers of abundance. Sometimes this was surely propaganda. Every ruler wants his subjects to believe that crops grew because he was wise, and the rivers behaved because he was favoured by heaven. But propaganda works best when it attaches itself to something people know is real. A repaired canal mattered. A cleared channel mattered. A new watercourse that opened land to cultivation mattered more than a flattering inscription ever could. Still, the king did not personally dig every channel. Neither did the gods. That is the quiet point hidden beneath the grand claims of temple and palace. In Mesopotamian religion, the gods possessed immense authority. Enlil could command the winds. Enki, or Ea in later Akkadian tradition, was closely connected with fresh water wisdom and the deep subterranean waters. Inanna could bring power, conflict and transformation. The divine realm set the conditions of existence, but a god statue did not climb into a silted canal with a basket. It did not spend days cutting reeds. It did not carry wet clay under a burning sun. Humans did that. The religious contrast is not necessarily that Sumerians thought their gods were weak. Far from it. Their gods were dangerous, unpredictable, and vastly greater than human beings. But myth repeatedly imagines the burden of labour as something that must be performed. And in stories like Atrahasis, humans exist precisely because the gods do not want to keep doing it themselves. The gods receive the results. Humans maintain the world that makes those results possible. And there is something almost haunting in that arrangement. A canal is easy to admire when it is full water glitters. Boats move through it. Fields on either side turn green. Granaries fill. Temple kitchens prepare offerings. A city seems prosperous and permanent, but the full canal is only the visible surface of thousands of earlier actions. Someone cleared the silt, someone patched the bank. Someone measured the rations. Someone ordered a crew into the mud. Someone missed a meal, strained a shoulder, lost skin from their palms, and returned the next day because the water would not wait. Civilization in this sense was not built once, it was maintained. Year after year the people of Sumer dug and redug the channels that kept their cities alive. They made nature usable, then fought constantly to keep it usable. Their gods could be honoured with hymns, offerings and towering temples. But the canals demanded something different. They demanded coordination, endurance, memory and labour. And that was a human power. Number 3. Raising cities with the hoe. After the canals were cleared, after water had been persuaded to move through a landscape that did not naturally obey anyone, there was another tool waiting in the hands of the Sumerians, a tool so ordinary that it is almost easy to miss. No gold, no jewelled blade, no thunderbolt, just a hoe. But in Sumerian literature, the hoe was not merely a farm tool, it was divine. One ancient composition, usually called the Song of the Hoe, gives this humble implement an astonishing role in the making of the human world. The poem praises the hoe as an object of creation and power. It is connected with Enlil, one of the greatest gods in the Sumerian pantheon, lord of wind, authority, and the force that could determine the fate of cities and kings. And Enlil does not begin with a palace. He begins with a hoe. The details of these ancient poems can be difficult because the tablets are damaged, translations differ, and Sumerian literary language loves layers of meaning. A word may point toward farming, construction, ritual, kingship, and cosmic order all at once. But the central image is clear enough. Enlil takes up the hoe. With it, he cuts into the earth. He opens the ground. He creates the conditions in which human beings can emerge into an ordered world. Picture this. Before fields, before walls, before the crowded streets of Uruk and the world is still being arranged. Heaven and earth have been separated. The great powers have been assigned their places. Then the god reaches for a tool known to every labourer. Not a weapon meant to destroy an enemy, not a royal sceptre meant to command obedience. A hoe, a thing used to cut, lift, break, shape and clear. The poem treats it almost like a living being. The hoe has a shining face. It has force. It has a destiny. It is praised as an instrument that brings forth abundance and makes settled human life possible. In some interpretations of the text, Enlil uses it at a place called Duranki, the bond or link between heaven and earth. There he breaks open the ground, and humanity comes forth from the soil. That image is worth slowing down for. In many ancient traditions, humans are made from clay, dust, earth, or mud. Mesopotamia knew this idea well, but the Song of the Hoe gives the creation of humanity a very physical quality. People do not simply appear because a god speaks a sentence. The earth must be opened, the ground must be worked. A tool must strike the soil. It is creation imagined, not as effortless magic, but as labour. Of course, this does not mean the Sumerians believed Enlil was literally a field worker sweating through a hot afternoon. This is religious poetry. The divine hoe is a cosmic hoe. Enlil's act establishes order at the largest possible scale, but the poem gives that cosmic act a familiar human shape. The god's world begins with the same motion that ordinary people knew in their backs, shoulders, hands, and blistered palms. Push down, break the crust, lift the earth, do it again, and again. There is something very Sumerian about that. For people living on the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, Earth was never just background scenery. It was building material, farmland, canal bank, road surface, wall, floor, pot, tablet and grave. Mud brick formed houses and temples. Clay preserved contracts and songs. Silt from the rivers made crops possible, while also clogging the channels that carried water. The ground fed you, trapped you, buried you, and supplied the material from which your entire city could be remade. So when a poem praises the hoe, it is praising more than agriculture. It is praising the power to transform raw ground into a human world. And here the title of this list begins to make sense. Not as a claim that no god in every religion could ever do such a thing, but as a contrast embedded in the Sumerian imagination itself. The gods could authorize order. They could decree destinies. They could own cities and receive their offerings. Yet the human world depended on actions that happened close to the ground: cutting, carrying, pressing, levelling, repairing. The divine hoe could open the earth at the beginning of time. But after that beginning, it was human beings who had to keep using hoes. There is an even stranger possibility hidden in the poem. The hoe is not only an object wielded by a god, it becomes a symbol of the boundary between wild land and settled life. Before the hoe, earth is simply earth. After the hoe, it can become a field, a foundation, a courtyard, a channel edge, a place where people can gather and remain. If you enjoy these old mysteries, there is also a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. Because the more you look at ancient texts like this, the more you realize that even their simplest objects can carry entire worlds of meaning. Think about the oddness of it. A modern reader may expect the first great tool of civilization to be a sword, a wheel, a ship, or perhaps a writing stylus. And all of those objects mattered, but the Song of the Hoe places its faith in something quieter, a digging tool, a tool for making a cut in the earth and refusing to leave the landscape exactly as it was. The poem likely belonged to a world where tools could be honoured because everyone understood what they cost. A hoe was not an abstract symbol printed on a page. It was wood, perhaps fitted with a blade, handled by someone whose work determined whether grain would grow, whether mud could be moved, whether a household could endure another season. And the Sumerians did not separate these practical realities from religion as neatly as we often do. To work the earth was not outside the sacred order. It was part of it. The gods had established the pattern. The tool had divine significance. The labourer carried that significance into the soil. But there was still a difference between praising the hoe and lifting it. The hymn could call it splendid. Enlil could make it sacred. Temple singers could recite its powers in carefully memorized lines. Yet when a city needed ground prepared, when a wall needed repair, when a new space had to be cut from the packed earth, the tool had to pass into human hands. And that is where the real cities began. Not in a sudden burst of royal planning. Not with a god lowering a finished temple from the sky. Cities rose because thousands of people altered the ground, one basket of soil at a time. Southern Mesopotamia was flat, extremely flat. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates had been built up over thousands of years by river silt, layer after layer of fine mud deposited by floods. This made the soil fertile. It also made the landscape unstable. A river could shift its channel. A flood could wash across low ground. Rain, when it came, could turn streets into mud, and the clay beneath a house could slowly settle under its weight. To build a permanent settlement there, people first had to create a surface that was higher, firmer, and more controlled than the land around it. They cut earth, they carried it, they packed it down. They raised platforms, they filled hollows, they shaped slopes so water would run away from walls instead of through them. They laid mud brick on foundations of more mud brick, then repaired the same structures after each season of wind, rain, and flood. It sounds almost boring, but this was one of the great human achievements. A city is not just a collection of buildings. A city is a decision to keep a particular place alive, even when the landscape keeps trying to reclaim it. Think of an early settlement on the Mesopotamian plain. At first there may be a few houses made from reeds and mud, a storage area, a shrine, paths worn into the dirt by bare feet and livestock. Then more people arrive. The paths become lanes. The shrine receives offerings and grows larger. Houses are rebuilt, often directly on top of earlier houses. Broken walls are knocked down and used as fill. New floors are laid over old floors. Generation after generation, the settlement rises. This is why ancient Mesopotamian cities eventually became tells, broad artificial mounds built from the accumulated remains of human life. Not all at once, not through one spectacular construction project, but through endless rebuilding. A wall falls, its bricks become fill. A courtyard is raised, a house is widened, a temple platform is enlarged. The ground itself becomes a record of labour. Under the ruins of a later city could lie dozens of earlier cities, each one compressed into the earth like pages in a book no one can read without digging. By the 4th millennium BCE, places such as Uruk were becoming something new in human history. Uruk was not simply a large village. At its height, it covered an enormous area for its time, perhaps tens of thousands of inhabitants. Its great temple districts stood on raised platforms. Its neighbourhoods spread outward in dense clusters. Its people needed food brought in from surrounding fields, water managed through canals, mud bricks produced in staggering quantities, and streets kept passable. None of that happened by accident. For every impressive temple wall, there were workers digging clay from pits. There were people mixing mud with chopped straw. Others pressed the mixture into moulds, turned the bricks out, and left them to dry under the Mesopotamian sun. Others carried those bricks to a construction site. Others spread bitumen or mud mortar between them. Others hauled away debris. Others repaired the work when the bricks began to crumble. And mud brick does crumble. That is one reason Mesopotamian building was never really finished. Baked brick could last longer, especially when protected by bitumen, but it was expensive and often reserved for important parts of major buildings. Most houses, walls, and platforms relied on sun-dried brick. Strong enough when maintained, vulnerable when neglected. So a city required maintenance, the way a body requires breathing. Its walls had to be patched, its drains cleared, its foundations reinforced, its streets raised above standing water, its canal banks rebuilt after floods. A city that stopped working could begin sinking back into the plain surprisingly fast. This is the deeper meaning of raising cities with the hoe. The tool did not just break soil for planting. It helped make the physical stage on which urban life could happen. The same action that cut a furrow could cut a foundation trench. The same basket that carried dirt from a canal could carry fill for a platform. The same labour that shaped a field could shape a neighbourhood, a wall, a sacred precinct, an entire city skyline. And these projects demanded organisation. Someone had to decide where labourers went. Someone had to measure land, distribute rations, store grain, and record who had contributed work. Temples and later palaces became centres of this coordination, though the exact balance of their power changed across centuries and from city to city. The surviving tablets usually preserve the viewpoint of administrators, priests, and rulers. They tell us about allocations, work teams, deliveries, and obligations. They do not often preserve the thoughts of the person lifting the basket, but we can still see their work everywhere in the thickness of city walls, in the raised floors of ancient houses, in the enormous terraces beneath temples, in the canals, drains, embankments, and packed earth streets. The cities of Sumer were made from mud, yes, but mud does not arrange itself into a city. Human beings did that. The gods, in the Sumerian religious imagination, could be the owners of a city. A god could dwell in its temple, receive its food, protect its king, or abandon it in anger. But the city's actual weight rested on human shoulders. If the workers stopped cutting earth, carrying brick, and repairing what the rivers and weather destroyed, even the house of a god would crack. So the ancient contrast is quietly brutal. The god may possess the city, but the human being raises it. Number 4, caring for divine statues. Once the city had been raised from mud and labour, it needed someone to live at its centre. Not a king, exactly. Not an administrator with a clay tablet and a seal. Not even the crowd of workers who had carried the bricks, dredged the canals, and kept the streets above the floodwater. In the Sumerian imagination, the true resident of the city was its god. Each great city had a divine patron. Uruk belonged above all to Inanna. Nippur belonged to Enlil. Eridu was the city of Enki. Ur belonged to Nanna, the moon god. Their temples were not simply places where people gathered to think about the divine. They were households, estates, economic centres, and, in a religious sense, homes occupied by beings more powerful than any human ruler. But here is where the idea becomes strange to modern ears. The god's presence could be focused in a statue, not just represented by it, not merely symbolized by it. For the people serving the temple, the statue could function as the god's earthly body, the form through which the deity received offerings, issued protection, and remained present in the city. This did not mean that Sumerians thought a god was only a carved figure of wood, stone, metal, or precious materials. Their gods belonged to the vast order of heaven, earth, rivers, storms, fertility, kingship, and fate. They could act far beyond the walls of one sanctuary. But a divine image made that power local. It gave the god an address. Picture the sacred precinct of an early Mesopotamian city. Beyond the workshops, storehouses, grain bins, and mud brick walls stood the temple itself. Its inner rooms were not public spaces in the modern sense. Access was controlled. Ordinary people might bring offerings, participate in festivals, or stand within temple courtyards. But the god's most sacred image belonged deeper inside, attended by trained personnel. For the city, that statue was not decoration. It was the divine master or mistress of the household. And unlike a distant god in the sky, a statue could be approached. It could be presented with food. It could be carried in procession. It could leave the temple during festivals and travel through the streets, allowing the god to visit other shrines, inspect the city, or join a larger sacred ceremony. When people bowed before the image, they were not necessarily bowing before a piece of crafted material. They were bowing before Inanna, before Enlil, before Nanna, before the being whose favour might mean fertile fields, military success, healthy herds, safe childbirth, or the continued survival of the city itself. That is a heavy responsibility to place on an object. and it tells us something important about ancient religion. The line between material and divine was not always as sharp as we imagine. A statue was made by human hands, certainly. Craftsmen selected the wood. Metal workers shaped ornaments. Stone workers carved features. Textile workers prepared garments. But after rituals that scholars often describe as acts of divine animation or consecration, the image was treated as more than the sum of its materials. It had entered another category. There is still debate about exactly how these rituals were understood at different times and in different Mesopotamian cultures. The evidence comes from later Akkadian and Babylonian texts as well as Sumerian traditions, and the practices changed over thousands of years. But the basic principle is clear enough. The image did not become important because it was beautiful. It became beautiful because it belonged to a god, and that god depended on humans in a very particular way. Not for cosmic power, Enlil did not need a human to make the wind blow. Enki did not need a worker to fill the underground waters. Inanna did not need a temple attendant to be formidable. In the religious stories, the gods could command destinies and shake the world with decisions made in their divine assembly. But in the temple, their presence required service. A human attendant had to enter the sacred rooms. Human hands had to prepare what the god would receive. Human eyes had to notice if an ornament was missing, if a sacred object had been damaged, if the temple's order had been disturbed. The divine image could be glorious, terrifying, and surrounded by wealth. It could not manage its own household. That is the contrast behind this entry. In the Sumerian religious world, the god was greater than the human in almost every imaginable way. Yet the god's image, the god's earthly presence in the temple, relied on a chain of human care so constant that it could almost disappear from notice, like breathing. And if you enjoy mysteries from the ancient world, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. Some of the deepest mysteries are not hidden in distant tombs or lost ruins. Sometimes they are hidden in the ordinary routines people repeated so faithfully that no one thought to explain them. For a temple attendant, the divine statue was never ordinary. It was the center of a living relationship between city and God. The statue received attention not because it was helpless in the way a human child is helpless, but because neglect could be understood as a failure of duty toward the power that protected the whole community. And that duty began, day after day, with the most intimate kind of service. At dawn, before the markets filled, and before labour gangs moved toward the fields and canals, temple service began. The doors of the inner sanctuary were opened by people who had prepared themselves for the task. Purity mattered. Clean bodies, clean garments, careful movements, spoken formulas, and restricted access all helped separate this work from ordinary domestic chores. To wash a divine statue was not the same as washing a bowl. To place a garment over its shoulders was not the same as dressing a wealthy noble. Every action acknowledged rank. The god was the highest ranking presence in the city. Higher than the Ensi, the local ruler. Higher than the scribes recording grain deliveries. Higher than the merchants with silver and imported cedar. So the image was served with the ceremony appropriate to a ruler whose authority reached beyond human institutions. The details are not always perfectly clear, especially for the earliest Sumerian periods. The surviving evidence is scattered across administrative records, hymns, temple texts, and later Mesopotamian ritual traditions. We have to be careful not to imagine one unchanging routine practiced identically in every city for 3,000 years. But the broad pattern is unmistakable. Divine images were washed. Their garments were changed. Their ornaments were maintained. Their sacred spaces were cleaned and supplied. Temple personnel treated the god's image as the recipient of ongoing daily care. Think about what that required. Water had to be drawn, carried, and kept suitable for ritual use. Fine cloth had to be woven somewhere in the temple economy or acquired through exchange. Wool needed to be cleaned, spun, dyed, and turned into garments. Metal ornaments had to be made by skilled craftspeople. Beads, pins, crowns, jewellery, belts, and ceremonial objects had to be protected from damage and theft. A god might command the storm, but the god's robe still had to be fastened by human fingers. This is one of those ancient contrasts that sounds almost humorous at first, until you see how seriously it was taken. In the old religious imagination, a deity could decide the fate of kings. Yet the god's image could not wash its own face, arrange its own hair, choose its own clothing, or notice that yesterday's garment had gathered dust. Humans did that, and they did it because the order of the temple was believed to reflect the order of the world. A well-kept image showed that the relationship between city and deity remained intact. Carelessness was not merely sloppy housekeeping. It could be a religious failure, a sign that people were neglecting the power on which their security depended. Imagine the pressure on the attendant responsible for such work. You are not preparing a statue for display, you are approaching the earthly presence of the being who governs your city's prosperity. Outside the temple walls, farmers are waiting for water. Herdsmen are watching the sky. Families are hoping children survive illness. Rulers are worrying about enemies beyond the horizon. And inside, in a controlled sacred room, someone is washing the image, arranging its garments, and making certain that everything is as it should be. The clothing itself could express divine identity. A goddess associated with power, love, warfare, or abundance might receive splendid fabrics and jewelry. A god associated with kingship or cosmic authority might appear in robes and insignia that reflected majesty. These were not random decorations. Clothing communicated status in Mesopotamian society, and the divine wardrobe made the god's status visible in the strongest possible terms. The image did not need warmth in the biological sense. It was not a human body, but ritual clothing made visible what the city believed. This presence was honoured, powerful, and properly installed at the centre of communal life. There is something almost moving about that daily repetition. Generations of unnamed workers, priests, textile makers, cleaners, carriers, and administrators gave their labour to an image that could never thank them in an ordinary human voice. They served because service itself was part of the agreement between humanity and the divine. The gods had made the world ordered, at least in the stories. Humans maintained that order through work, and so each washed garment, each polished ornament, each carefully prepared sacred room became part of a much larger system. The temple did not run on abstract faith alone. It ran on water, wool, labour, schedules, storage rooms, and people who understood exactly what had to be done before the day could properly begin. The gods of Sumer were not powerless. Far from it. But in their earthly houses they depended on human hands for a task no god could perform for itself. And once the divine image had been washed, dressed, and made ready to receive the day, there was another duty waiting just beyond the sanctuary door. The god had to be fed. Number 5. Preparing the god's daily meals. Once the divine image had been washed, dressed, and settled into the order of the morning, the temple workers faced another responsibility. The god had to receive offerings, not symbolic offerings in the casual modern sense. Not a single bowl set down once a year during a festival and then forgotten. The temples of Sumer were organized around regular provision. Their gods were treated as great lords, resident powers whose households required constant attention. And like any powerful household, that meant storerooms, workers, schedules, inventories, vessels, ovens, courtyards, and kitchens. A temple was not just a quiet place for prayer. It was an institution. In some cities, it was one of the largest institutions anyone would ever encounter. Land belonged to it. Herds could belong to it. Workshops, fishing crews, gardeners, weavers, boatmen, labour gangs, scribes and priests could all be connected to its economy. Goods moved in from fields, marshes, orchards, flocks, distant trade routes, and the labour of ordinary families. Then those goods moved again. Some were redistributed as wages and rations. Some were stored against shortages. Some supported festivals, construction, or royal ceremonies. And some entered the sacred system of offerings, where human labour became service to the god. Picture the temple kitchen before sunrise. Workers are already awake. Someone has opened a storeroom and checked the seals on jars and baskets. Someone else is carrying water. Fires have to be managed. Fuel has to be gathered. Pots have to be cleaned. Grinding stones have to be ready. Serving vessels have to be brought out, inspected, and placed where they belong. None of this happened by magic. The god could send rain, according to the religious imagination. The god could protect the city, bless a king, or turn away disaster. But the god did not unlock the storehouse, did not count supplies, did not scrub a cooking vessel after yesterday's ritual, did not notice that a jar had cracked, that fuel was running low, or that the delivery from a temple estate had arrived late. Humans noticed. And because these were offerings for a deity, the ordinary demands of cooking became charged with ritual importance. The people involved were not simply preparing household provisions. They were maintaining the visible bond between the city and its divine owner. That phrase matters, divine owner. In Sumerian thought, a city was often understood as belonging to its god. Uruk belonged to Inanna. Nippur belonged to Enlil. Eridu belonged to Enki. Each great city had its own sacred centre, its own divine patron, and its own complex relationship between land, labour, rulers, and temple authority. The people lived in the god's city. They worked the god's fields. They repaired the god's canals. They maintained the god's house. And in the kitchens of that house, they prepared what the god was due. We should be careful here. The surviving texts do not give us a perfect, uninterrupted view of every temple kitchen in every Sumerian city. Much of the evidence comes from administrative tablets, lists of goods, deliveries, workers, vessels, animals, fields, and rations. These can seem dry at first. A tablet may record quantities and names with almost no explanation. But that dryness is exactly what makes it powerful. It tells us this was routine. A hymn can praise a god with beautiful language. An administrative tablet tells you that somebody had to make sure the supplies arrived on time. One record after another reveals a world of organized provision. Temple personnel tracked commodities with astonishing care. Scribes pressed marks into wet clay to record what came in and what went out. Storage areas were supervised. Workers were assigned. Standards and measures mattered. A missing delivery was not just an inconvenience. It could disrupt the daily machinery of divine service. Imagine being the official responsible. You are not dealing with a flexible customer. You cannot tell the god of the city that there has been a misunderstanding, that the account is short, that the workers are tired, or that the river journey took longer than expected. The ritual calendar continues. The god's household has its requirements. And everyone understands that neglecting those requirements may have consequences far beyond one embarrassing conversation. Crop failure, sickness, political defeat, flooding, drought. Ancient Mesopotamians lived with dangers they could not fully control. They looked for signs of divine anger or divine favour in a world where a bad season could threaten thousands of lives. So keeping the temple supplied was not merely bureaucracy. It was risk management on a cosmic scale. And if you enjoy these moments where ordinary objects and daily routines open into much stranger ancient mysteries, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description now. It is tempting to imagine the temple kitchen as a separate hidden space, far away from the real economy of the city. But it was deeply connected to everything around it. Farmers, herders, fishermen, transport workers, potters, metalworkers and scribes all played a role directly or indirectly. A divine meal began long before anyone entered the sanctuary. It began with irrigation ditches cut through hard soil. It began with animals tended in temple pastures. It began with clay jars shaped by potters, reeds gathered for baskets, wood brought from scarce sources, and workers carrying heavy loads through streets already warming under the Mesopotamian sun. By the time an offering reached the god, it represented the effort of an entire community. That was the strange logic at the centre of it all. The gods were imagined as immensely powerful, but their earthly presence depended on a chain of human work, so long and so carefully organised that it could fill a city. And soon inside the temple, that labour would be arranged, presented, and transformed into the daily meal of a god. At the centre of that meal were the most basic foods in Mesopotamia, bread and beer. That might sound almost modest. Bread, beer, perhaps dates, cheese, milk, fruit, fish or meat on special occasions. But in ancient Sumer, these were not casual items. They were the foundation of life. Grain had to be planted, irrigated, harvested, threshed, cleaned, ground, mixed, shaped, baked, and recorded. Beer required grain too, often in processed forms, along with water, vessels, labour, and knowledge passed through generations. To offer bread and beer was to offer concentrated human effort. Think about a loaf of bread placed before a god. It had started months earlier as barley growing in a field beside a canal. Workers had diverted water toward it. Others had guarded the crop, harvested it with sickles, carried it to storage, and prepared it for milling. Someone had turned the grain into flour. Someone had mixed dough. Someone had controlled the heat of the oven closely enough to make food worthy of a deity. The god received the finished loaf, but only humans could make it. This is where the strange contrast in Sumerian religion becomes especially sharp. The gods were believed to command storms, fertility, kingship, rivers, and the unseen structure of the world. Yet their images in their earthly temples depended on things that no god was imagined as physically doing for himself. No god sowed the barley, no god spent the morning with flour clinging to their hands. No god watched a batch of dough and worried whether the fire was too hot. The divine household required human providers. Beer carried the same meaning, perhaps even more strongly. In Mesopotamia, beer was not merely a luxury drink. It was a major part of daily nourishment. It appeared in rations. It appeared at feasts. It appeared in religious settings. Brewing transformed grain through a process that must have seemed almost miraculous, hard seeds becoming a sustaining drink. But it was a human miracle. Someone had to prepare the grain. Someone had to manage fermentation. Someone had to clean the jars and carry the liquid in heavy containers. And someone had to make sure the beer assigned for the god was the correct amount, in the correct vessel, at the correct time. Because correctness mattered. Ancient ritual was often less about spontaneous emotion than about doing things properly. The right food, the right sequence, the right words. The right personnel, the right container set in the right place. To modern eyes, that may seem rigid, but for the people involved, order was protection. The universe itself depended on boundaries holding firm. River and field, city and wilderness, living and dead, human and divine. A properly arranged meal helped keep those boundaries intact. And then there were the animals, sheep, goats, cattle, birds, fish. The exact offerings varied by place, period, festival and deity, and our evidence is uneven. But animal sacrifice was unquestionably part of Mesopotamian religious life. A valuable animal was not simply food waiting to be eaten. It represented breeding, grazing land, herders, water, transport, and accounting. In a landscape where animals were wealth, presenting one to a god was a serious act. The sacrificial meal made that seriousness visible. An animal could be brought into the sacred system, prepared according to ritual rules, and presented as part of the god's provisions. In some cases, portions associated with the deity were set before the divine image, while other portions could be distributed among temple personnel or used in communal ceremonial contexts. The details differed, and scholars still debate exactly how every rite worked. But the broad principle is clear. Food moved upward toward the god, and then outward through the human institution that served the god. Nothing vanished into thin air. The divine meal was part of an economy. It connected farm labourers to priests, herders to scribes, rulers to workers, and ordinary grain to cosmic duty. A sheep offered in the temple had a history. It had been born in a herd, watched by someone in the heat, counted by someone with a clay tablet, perhaps moved through a gate under official supervision. By the time it became a sacred meal, the entire system of the city was present within it. This is probably why temple records can feel so intense once you know what you're looking at. A list of barley measures is not just a list of barley measures. It may be evidence of a city trying to feed its god. A notation about animals is not just livestock management. It may be part of a promise between a community and the power believed to guard it. And imagine the pressure of that promise. If the bread was absent, if the beer ran short, if the sacrificial animal did not arrive, this was not treated as a small catering problem. It could be understood as a break in divine service. In a world shaped by unpredictable floods, failed harvests, epidemics and war, people did not want to discover what happened when the god's household was neglected. So they prepared the meals, day after day, season after season, generation after generation. Human beings baked the bread, brewed the beer, raised the animals, carried the vessels, spoke the formulas, and set the food before beings who were imagined as more powerful than kings. That is the fifth thing humans could do that the gods, in this very Sumerian religious sense, could not. They could feed the divine. Not because the gods were weak in every way. The Sumerians would have found that idea absurd. But because divine power on earth was expressed through a household of clay, grain, flesh, fire, and human hands. And those hands never stopped working. 6, paying temple and palace dues. And once those hands had prepared the food, carried the vessels, and kept the divine household running, they entered an even larger system. Because a Sumerian temple was not only a place where people prayed, it was an estate. Picture the temple rising above the crowded streets of an early Mesopotamian city. Its walls marked sacred ground. Its gates led toward courtyards, storerooms, workshops, offices, kitchens, and perhaps gardens and animal enclosures. Somewhere inside stood the image of the god receiving its daily care. But surrounding that sacred centre was something enormous and practical, an institution that controlled land, grain, animals, workers, tools, and information. The temple was a house for a god, but it was also one of the great economic engines of the city. In Sumerian thought, this made perfect sense. A city belonged, in some deep religious sense, to its patron deity. Uruk belonged to Inanna. Nippur was bound to Enlil. Eridu was associated with Enki. Each great god had a household, a domain, and a body of human servants responsible for maintaining what belonged to that divine power. Fields could belong to the temple, Herds could belong to the temple. Fishing grounds, date groves, workshops, storehouses, and boats might all be connected to the temple household. The god was understood as the ultimate owner. Human officials, priests, labourers, and scribes managed the property below. And that property could be immense. Mesopotamia was not an easy land to farm. The southern plain had rich soil, but rain was unreliable. To grow barley and other crops at scale, communities depended on canals. Canals required planning, they required digging, they required repair after floods, clearing after silt, and constant attention when embankments began to fail. So a successful temple estate was not simply land sitting quietly in the sun. It was land connected to water, labour, animals, storage, and administration. It was an entire machine made from mud brick, reeds, clay tablets, and human memory. A temple might oversee fields far beyond the sacred enclosure itself. Workers planted and harvested barley. Shepherds watched flocks. Boatmen moved supplies along canals. Weavers turned wool into cloth. Potters made jars for storage and ritual use. Millers processed grain. Brewers made beer. Bakers prepared bread. Metal workers repaired tools. Scribes counted it all. The temple did not merely receive offerings. It helped organize the world that produced them. This is one reason the ancient tablets are so fascinating. At first glance, many of them can look painfully ordinary. Numbers, names, measures of grain, lists of sheep. Notes about wool, records of land. Tiny clay rectangles impressed with wedge-shaped marks by someone who lived 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But those marks are the pulse of a city. They tell us that sacred power was tied to practical power. A god's temple needed reliable food, reliable labour, reliable supplies, and reliable records. It needed to know what had entered a storeroom, what had left it, who had received wool, how many animals were alive, how much grain had been processed, and whether the system was still functioning. The divine order had an accounting department, and perhaps that is one of the most human details in all of ancient religion. People could imagine gods who shaped destinies, sent storms, blessed kings, and decided the fate of armies. But even the god's earthly household required a person to press a reed stylus into wet clay and make sure the numbers added up. No god, in this Sumerian contrast, sits cross-legged in a storeroom counting jars of barley. A human being does that. The temple's economic role also explains why it stood at the centre of so much daily life. It was not separate from the city in the way a modern person might imagine a religious building being separate from a business, farm, or government office. Those boundaries were not always sharp. Religious authority, political authority, and economic organisation could overlap, compete, and change over time. The evidence varies from one city and period to another. Early temple institutions were especially important, while later royal palaces became major centres of landholding and administration as well. We should not imagine every Sumerian city operating by one identical rulebook. Mesopotamian history stretches across many centuries, and its institutions changed constantly. Still, the broad pattern is hard to miss. Temples held resources. Resources created influence. Influence allowed temples to support large staffs, conduct rituals, manage production, and participate in the life of the city at a scale no ordinary household could match. If you enjoy these strange moments where ancient records reveal a world more complicated than it first appears, there is also a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. Now imagine being an ordinary person in that world. You may not live behind the temple walls. You may spend your days in a small mud brick home, tending a plot, making cloth, herding animals, fishing canals, or carrying goods through dust and heat. But the great temple estate is never truly far away. Its fields may lie beside yours. Its officials may pass through the streets. Its storehouses may shape the movement of grain when harvest comes. Its rituals may determine the rhythm of festival days. And beyond the temple, another great household is growing in power. The palace. The palace was also a household, but on an even more visibly human scale. Where the temple belonged to the god, the palace belonged to the ruler, who claimed to govern with divine favour. Kings did not usually present themselves as ordinary men who had simply become rich and powerful. They were chosen, favoured, shepherd-like figures, responsible for justice, defence, canals, walls, and the proper maintenance of the land. But whatever the royal ideology said, the palace had the same practical needs as every large institution. It needed grain, it needed animals, it needed boats, timber, bricks, weapons, cloth, workers, messengers, scribes, guards, and people willing or unwilling to carry out orders. And those things had to come from somewhere. This is where the quiet pressure of ancient administration enters the story. Modern people often use the word taxes, and it is useful up to a point. But we should be careful. There was no single Sumerian tax office operating by one neat set of laws across every city and every century. The obligations recorded in surviving tablets could take many forms. Payments in barley, deliveries of livestock, shares of crops, rental dues, fees, levies, required supplies, and perhaps most important of all, labour. A person might owe not coins, because coins had not yet been invented, but produce. Barley was especially important. It could be eaten, brewed into beer, measured, stored, distributed, and used as a standard unit of value. A field produced barley. Barley entered a storehouse. The storehouse supplied workers, officials, craft specialists, and institutions. On a tablet, a few impressed wedges could record the whole process. So imagine harvest season. The barley is cut, bundles are gathered. Grain is threshed and measured, dust hangs in the hot air. Someone knows exactly how much has been taken from the field. Someone knows how much should arrive at a storehouse. Someone knows which household, which worker, which overseer, which field, and which institution is connected to that grain. And if the expected amount does not appear, someone notices. That is the part that can feel surprisingly modern. Not the exact system, not the legal categories, but the basic experience. A larger authority makes a claim on what you produce. Your work is not entirely your own. Your harvest is not entirely your own. Your time is not entirely your own. The ancient word for this was not necessarily tax in our sense. But the burden was real, and sometimes the payment was your body. Compulsory labour was one of the great facts of life in early states. A canal had to be cleared before irrigation season. A city wall had to be repaired. A temple complex needed bricks. A royal building project needed mud hauled, reeds cut, and workers organised. Roads, embankments, docks, fortifications and waterways did not appear because a king gave an inspiring speech about civic pride. They appeared because human beings dug, carried, hauled, shaped and built. In later Mesopotamian history we find terms for labour obligations that scholars often compare to corvée labour. Service owed to the state or ruler rather than freely chosen employment. The exact arrangements changed over time. Some workers received rations. Some may have been temporarily called up from their communities. Some labourers were dependent personnel tied to institutions. Some were skilled specialists. Some were probably there because refusing an official demand was not a realistic option. The tablets do not always tell us how people felt about it. That is one of the silences of ancient history. A tablet may list workers assigned to clear a canal. It may record rations issued to a labour gang. It may note the number of men, the number of work days, the amount of grain. But it rarely pauses to say whether someone woke before dawn with dread in his stomach, whether a mother worried about the field left behind, whether a labourer cursed the overseer under his breath. Clay preserves the count. It does not always preserve the complaint. Still, we can read between the lines. If a city depends on irrigation, then canal labour is not optional in the deepest sense. Without water management, fields fail. Without fields, grain disappears. Without grain, the storehouse is empty. The gods receive fewer offerings. The palace cannot feed workers or soldiers. The city weakens. So authorities could present compulsory labour not merely as a demand, but as a necessity. You work on the canal because everyone needs the canal. You repair the wall because enemies may come. You deliver grain because the institution must function. You contribute because the city, the king, and the god all depend on order. And perhaps sometimes that was true, but necessity can also be a very effective language of power. The man hauling baskets of mud may understand that the canal matters. He may also understand that the officials who summoned him will not be carrying baskets beside him. This was the strange bargain of civilization on the Mesopotamian plain. Large communities could accomplish things that isolated households could never manage. They could maintain huge irrigation networks. They could store food against bad seasons. They could build walls, organize trade, support artisans, and create cities whose names still echo after 5,000 years. But the same system that made collective survival possible also made demands. It counted households, it measured fields, it assessed deliveries. It summoned labour, and it wrote obligations down. That last part matters. Writing was not born only from poetry, prophecy, or grand royal speeches. Some of its earliest uses were painfully practical. Who owes grain? Who delivered wool? Who worked for how long? Which animals entered the enclosure? What was taken from storage? What is still missing? The first cities did not just invent monuments. They invented paperwork, and paperwork is powerful because it can turn a human obligation into something that seems solid, fixed, and unavoidable. A spoken demand can be argued with. A clay tablet, sealed and witnessed, has a different weight. It says that the debt exists beyond memory. It says an institution remembers. For the Sumerians, this could be woven into a religious vision of the world. The gods had assigned humanity its role. People maintained the divine and earthly order through work, offerings, service, and obedience. The gods commanded, protected, judged, and received. Humans planted, counted, delivered, and laboured. No god in this ancient contrast waits in line while an official calculates how much barley is due. No god is entered onto a labour roster. No god is told to report at sunrise with a hoe, a basket, and enough food to last the day. That was the human condition. To belong to a city was, in part, to belong to its burdens. Number 7. Working for grain rations. If the previous burden was the obligation to give, this one is the daily reality of receiving. Thousands upon thousands of Mesopotamian clay tablets record a world measured in portions. A worker receives barley, a group receives beer, a team gets oil, wool, dates, or perhaps an allotment of grain calculated for a specific number of days. The tablet names the recipient or the work gang, gives a quantity, sometimes adds a date, and then disappears into an archive where it may sit undisturbed for 4,000 years. It can look dry at first, just numbers pressed into clay. But those numbers are people. A small wedge can mean 1 day of food. A larger sign can mean a month of barley. A line on a tablet might record rations for women processing grain, men hauling reeds, boat crews, herders, brickmakers, gardeners, millers, textile workers and children attached to a household or work group. The language is administrative. The reality is physical. Someone had to eat. Someone had to keep working tomorrow. And barley was the great measure of that world, not money in the modern sense. There were no stamped coins passing from hand to hand in early Sumer, but barley could do many of the things money does. It could be counted, stored, transferred, exchanged, brewed, and distributed. It could be used to calculate what labour was worth, or at least what labour was allotted. A worker might not be handed a shining piece of silver at the end of the week. Instead, the payment might be grain from a storehouse, enough to grind into flour, cook into porridge, bake into bread, or turn into beer. Beer mattered because it was not a luxury in the way we might imagine. In ancient Mesopotamia, beer was a basic part of diet and daily life. It provided calories. It was made from grain. It could be issued in standardized amounts. And unlike plain water from an uncertain canal or river, brewed drink could be safer to consume. So when tablets record beer rations, they are not describing a party after work. They are recording sustenance. Picture a scribe at the edge of a storeroom. Baskets of barley stand nearby. Perhaps the grain has been cleaned. Perhaps it is still dusty from the threshing floor. Jars and containers wait to be filled. Labourers gather as their names or the names of their supervisors are called. The scribe has wet clay in front of him. He takes a reed stylus and presses signs into the surface. So much barley, so much beer. For this group, for this month. The clay will dry, the food will be carried away, and the account will remain. The measurements themselves tell us how deeply organised this system could become. Ancient Mesopotamians used units such as the selah, a measure of volume roughly comparable to a litre, though exact values varied by period and place. Larger measures, including the ban and the gur, allowed administrators to scale upward from an individual ration to the needs of a workshop, a household, a crew, or an entire workforce. This is where the tablets become almost hypnotic. 1 siler, 2 siler, 10 siler, 30 days, 1 worker, 10 workers, 100 workers. A modern reader might glance at these entries and see bureaucracy. But imagine what it took to make those numbers real. Someone had to grow the grain. Someone had to thresh it. Someone had to move it in sacks or baskets. Someone had to guard the storehouse against pests, damp, theft, and spoilage. Someone had to calculate the issue, and someone had to press the final record into clay. A city does not run on grand speeches. It runs on measured portions. At sites connected with the great administrative systems of southern Mesopotamia, especially in the later 3rd millennium BCE, surviving records can be astonishingly detailed. Tablets track commodities moving in and out. They note shortages and deliveries. They distinguish kinds of workers. They record labour days. They sometimes show differences in rations according to age, sex, status, skill, or assigned work. That does not mean every tablet is perfectly clear to us. Far from it. Ancient accounting systems had their own abbreviations, local practices, damaged surfaces, and technical language. Scholars still debate details. A ration listed for a named person may not always mean that person personally held every grain recorded. A group entry may cover a household. A calculated amount may be a standard allocation rather than a description of what was actually consumed. But the overall pattern is impossible to miss. Human life was being converted into units that could be counted. Work could be translated into days. Days could be translated into grain. Grain could be translated into beer. And all of it could be impressed into clay by a man whose job was to make sure the numbers added up. It is a strange thing to hold one of these tablets in your imagination. A little lump of mud, often no bigger than a hand. Yet it may contain the food plan for dozens of people. It may preserve a month of labour more faithfully than the voices of the labourers themselves. The workers are mostly silent. The barley speaks for them. And if you enjoy these quiet mysteries hidden inside the ancient world, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. Now, there is an important distinction here. A ration was not necessarily a wage in the modern sense. It did not automatically mean free negotiation between an employer and an employee. It may have been compensation, maintenance, provision, or an officially calculated share. The same grain could be described differently depending on the time, city, and social position of the person receiving it. But whatever legal category we choose, the experience remained unmistakably mortal. You worked, and someone measured what you would eat. The gods of Sumer received offerings in abundance. They received bread, beer, meat, incense, and fine things brought before their statues. But in the religious imagination behind these records, no god stood waiting with an empty jar while a scribe decided whether the daily issue had been approved. No god had his portion reduced because the count was wrong. No god watched the grain level in the household bin and wondered whether it would last until the next distribution. That was for people. And the more closely we follow the ration tablets, the more clearly we can see just how many people lived by those measured, fragile portions. And those portions did not simply appear from the earth like rain. They came from institutions, from the temple household, from the palace, from the estate of a powerful official, from a storehouse connected to fields, herds, workshops, canals, boats, and scribal offices. For many workers in ancient Sumer and later Mesopotamian states, survival depended on being attached to one of these great organized households. That attachment could offer security, but it also created dependence. Picture the system as a giant machine made of mud brick, reeds, animals, grain, and human bodies. Fields produce crops, canals carry water, labour gangs harvest. Boats bring goods to the city. Storehouse workers receive them. Scribes record them. Officials authorize their movement. Then the food and materials flow back outward to the people doing the work. In theory, everyone has a place. The farmer belongs to a field team. The weaver belongs to a workshop. The boatman belongs to a transport crew. The gardener, the brewer, the shepherd, the miller, the brickmaker, the reed cutter, the cleaner of canals, all are connected to an institution larger than themselves. And that institution can feed you, but it can also command you. This is the part that is easy to miss when we look only at the surviving clay records. A tablet may calmly list workers as though they were pieces on a board, but every name, every group, every category represents a person whose access to food was tied to an administrative system they did not control. If the harvest failed, the storehouse had less to distribute. If war cut a trade route, supplies might not arrive. If a canal breached its bank, fields could be ruined by flood or salt. If an official was dishonest, careless, or simply under pressure from above, ordinary workers could feel the consequences immediately. The institution was a shelter. It was also a bottleneck. Think of it like being on a great ship crossing a dangerous sea. The ship gives you protection from the waves. It carries food, tools, and other people. It gives you a chance to survive where you might not survive alone. But you are not steering. You do not choose the destination. And if the captain makes a mistake, everyone below deck feels it. That was one of the basic facts of life in the early cities. The growth of large institutions made possible things that small villages could never easily manage. Massive irrigation networks, monumental temples, long-distance trade. Large workforces, emergency storage, organized craft production. A city could gather resources from a broad area and direct them towards some enormous project. It could feed people who were not farming at all. Scribes, metalworkers, priests, builders, singers, guards, and administrators could exist because grain moved through institutional hands. Civilization, in other words, was not just a collection of buildings. It was a promise. Work for us, and the system will sustain you. Sometimes that promise was kept. Sometimes it probably was not. We should be careful not to imagine all ancient workers as slaves, or all temple and palace households as identical machines of oppression. The evidence shows a complicated world. Some people owned property. Some hired labour, some had social standing, specialised skills, family networks, and room to negotiate. Others were deeply vulnerable, dependents, captives, debtors, displaced people, and those with few choices beyond the work assigned to them. But the broad imbalance is hard to escape. A great institution could survive the death of an individual worker. An individual worker could not always survive the failure of a great institution. And this is where the Sumerian contrast between gods and humans becomes especially sharp. The gods had temples because humans built them. They had fields because humans cultivated them. They had storehouses because humans filled them. In myth and ritual, divine beings might receive magnificent offerings, but they were not dependent in the same way a labourer was dependent. A god did not wait outside an official's doorway hoping an allotment had been approved. A god did not fear being transferred to harder work because a supervisor needed more hands. A god did not watch the palace gates during a season of scarcity and wonder whether the doors would open. Humans did, and perhaps that is why these quiet records feel so intimate. They show us not only an ancient economy, but an ancient anxiety. The anxiety of needing the larger system to continue functioning, needing the canal cleared, needing the harvest brought in, needing the scribes to record fairly, needing those above you to remember that you existed. The divine world in Sumerian thought stood above this fragile arrangement. Humans lived inside it. They built the temples, filled the granaries, and kept the cities alive. And in return, they hoped the city would keep them alive too. But when your life depends on institutions, you begin searching everywhere for signs of whether those institutions and the world around them are about to hold or fail. Number 8. Ridding omens from the world. When your life depends on rivers that can fail, harvests that can collapse, rulers who can make demands, and gods whose intentions are never fully transparent, the world stops looking ordinary. A strange cloud is not just a strange cloud. A sickly sheep is not just a sickly sheep. A dream that wakes you before dawn is not always just a dream. For the people of ancient Sumer, and for the later Mesopotamian civilizations that inherited and expanded many of these beliefs, the universe was full of signs. The gods were not silent exactly, but they did not speak to humans face to face whenever someone had a question. Instead, they could send messages through the world itself. This was the basic idea behind omens. The sky could carry a warning. The moon could reveal danger. An eclipse might signal that the established order was under threat. A sudden storm, an unusual birth, an animal behaving in an unsettling way, a crack in a wall, a snake crossing a path, all could seem like pieces of a message arriving from somewhere beyond human control. Not every ancient person necessarily experienced every strange event in the same way. We should be careful here. The surviving texts mostly come from temples, palaces, scribal schools, and educated specialists. They show us the beliefs that were written down, collected and organized by people with access to institutions. But they also reveal something larger, a deep Mesopotamian conviction that the visible world could disclose the invisible will of the gods. and that made the world feel alive with information. Imagine stepping outside a city gate before sunrise. The fields are still dark. Somewhere beyond the walls, workers are already moving toward canals and plots of barley. In the distance, animals call from their pens. Above you, the last stars are fading. For a modern observer, it might be a quiet morning. For an ancient watcher, it could be a page not yet read. The heavens were especially important because they were so vast, so regular, and so far beyond human reach. Humans could dig canals, raise walls, sow grain, and make offerings. But nobody could move the moon. Nobody could stop a planet from appearing in the wrong part of the sky. Nobody could command an eclipse not to come. The gods, in Mesopotamian thought, belonged to that higher level of power. They governed cosmic order. They could grant kingship, withdraw protection, send abundance, send disease, bring victory, or allow a city to fall. Yet their plans were not always announced in clear words. That uncertainty was one of the most frightening parts of human existence. A god might favour a city for generations and then turn away. A king might believe he had divine support only to lose a battle. A family might make the proper offerings and still face illness, infertility, or grief. So the question was always waiting beneath daily life. What are the gods about to do? And if they were about to do something, perhaps they had already left a clue. This is where the contrast in the title becomes meaningful. In the religious imagination of Sumer, a god did not need to search the sky for evidence of another god's intentions. A god was part of the divine assembly, part of the power behind the order of things. Humans were outside that certainty. Humans had to look. They had to notice. They had to wonder whether a bird's sudden flight, a damaged organ from a sacrificial animal, or an unsettling dream contained a warning meant for their city, their king, their household, or themselves. It is a very human position to occupy. You cannot see the future directly. You cannot enter the council of the gods. You cannot force the universe to explain itself. But you're intelligent enough to recognize patterns, frightened enough to search for them, and hopeful enough to believe that the warning might arrive in time. That hope mattered, because ancient Mesopotamia was not a stable place. The rivers gave life, but they also flooded. Fields could produce enormous harvests, then suffer from drought, salinization, pests or war. Cities competed, dynasties rose and vanished, armies crossed open plains. Disease moved through crowded settlements. A single decision by a ruler could change the lives of thousands. In a world like that, uncertainty was not philosophical. It was practical. Will the river rise too high? Will the army return? Will the king remain secure? Will the grain stores last through the season? Will a child recover from fever? The gods might know. Humans did not, and so messages were sought in everything. There is something almost haunting about this. The same world that sustained life could also become a kind of divine writing. A lamb born with an unusual feature might not be merely unfortunate. A darkening of the moon might not be merely astronomical. A dream might not remain private inside the sleeping mind. It might be a door briefly opened between the human and divine worlds. If you enjoy these strange places where history, mystery, and belief overlap, there is also a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with a link in the description. But for the people who lived beside the Euphrates and Tigris, this was not entertainment. The signs could concern survival. A ruler especially could not afford to ignore them. His reign was supposed to exist under divine approval. If the gods were displeased, the consequences might spread outward from palace to temple, from city wall to farm field. A bad sign was never necessarily only about one person. It could be about the entire land. And that is why the ancient world became so intensely watchful. Eyes turned upward toward the stars, eyes turned downward toward animals, water, smoke, and soil. Eyes turned inward after dreams. The gods, it seemed, had placed their messages everywhere. The difficult question was not whether the world could speak. The difficult question was how a human being was supposed to understand what it had said. Understanding the sign was the real labour. Anyone could see the moon darken. Anyone could notice that a sheep had been born strangely, or that a dream had left a person trembling in the morning. But turning that event into knowledge, deciding what it meant, who it concerned, how urgent it was, and what should be done next, that required a specialist. In Mesopotamia, divination became one of the great intellectual crafts. These specialists were not simply guessing, at least they were not supposed to be guessing. They were trained observers, readers, record keepers, and interpreters. They collected cases, they memorized formulas, they compared what was happening now with what had been observed before. In later Mesopotamian periods especially, scribes assembled immense omen series, tablets filled with statements that followed a basic pattern. If this happens, then that may follow. If the moon appears with a certain shape, a king may face danger. If an animal's organ has a certain mark, the army may succeed. If a person dreams of a particular image, illness, loss, or good fortune may be approaching. To modern eyes, it can seem strange. The connection between a mark on a liver and the fate of a kingdom does not follow the rules of modern science. But the method behind it reveals something deeply human. Faced with uncertainty, people built systems for organizing it. They did not want chaos. They wanted a map. Imagine a diviner sitting in a temple or palace room, holding the liver of a sacrificed sheep. The organ has been carefully examined. Its shape, its lobes, its scars, its unusual features, all are studied in detail. Mesopotamian diviners developed astonishingly elaborate terminology for the parts of the liver. They made clay models marked with labels, almost like ancient teaching diagrams. Students could learn the landscape of the organ, memorize what each feature was believed to indicate, and practice reading its complicated surface. It was not casual superstition. It was trained interpretation inside a religious world. The same was true of the sky. Watching the heavens required patience on a scale most people could barely imagine. A single eclipse might be terrifying, but its meaning depended on details. Which part of the moon darkened first? At what time did it happen? In which month? Which direction did the shadow move? How long did it last? Those details had to be observed, remembered, and compared. Over centuries, Mesopotamian scholars became extraordinary sky watchers. Their records eventually contributed to the long tradition we call Babylonian astronomy. But in the beginning, the purpose was not abstract science in the modern sense. It was political and religious survival. The sky was being studied because rulers needed to know whether danger was approaching, whether military campaigns should proceed, whether the land was secure, whether ritual action was required. And here is the uncomfortable part. The diviner was never fully certain. A sign could be difficult. Different details could point in different directions. A warning might apply to the king, the city, an enemy, or some event not yet understood. Even after all the training, all the tablets, all the careful observation interpretation remained a human act. That meant responsibility. If a king asked whether to march to war, the answer could affect thousands of lives. If an omen appeared unfavourable, advisers might recommend delay. If it seemed favourable, a campaign might move forward. There were rituals intended to manage danger, prayers, offerings, protective acts, and in some cases astonishing attempts to redirect fate itself. One famous Mesopotamian response to a threatening omen was the substitute king ritual. If signs appeared to predict danger for the actual ruler, another person could temporarily take the role of king while the real king withdrew from public view. The logic was brutal and strangely practical. If misfortune was coming for the king, perhaps it could fall upon the substitute instead. Whether such rituals always happened exactly as surviving texts describe is hard to know. Ancient records often preserve ideals, prescriptions, and elite concerns more clearly than everyday reality. But the ritual shows how seriously interpretation was taken. A sign was not merely discussed. It could change the behavior of a court, alter schedules, delay campaigns, and place human beings inside elaborate systems of protection. Dream interpretation worked in a similar way, though dreams were more personal and more elusive. A person might seek help after seeing a dead relative, falling into water, losing teeth, meeting a god, or wandering through an unfamiliar house. The interpreter had to translate the private confusion of sleep into a possible meaning for waking life, and that is what makes this item so revealing. The gods, in this ancient religious contrast, did not need diviners to explain the divine plan to them. Humans did. Humans were the ones standing beneath a sky they could not control, holding evidence they could not fully decode, trying to turn uncertainty into a decision before it was too late. They watched, they recorded, they argued over details. They searched old tablets for a pattern that matched the present moment. In a way, this was one of humanity's earliest attempts to make the future less frightening. Not by mastering it, because nobody could do that, but by studying every clue the world might offer. Yet even the finest diviner could not prevent time from moving forward. No interpretation could keep a body young forever. No ritual could guarantee that sickness would pass by every door. And after all the signs had been read, another human burden remained, to endure what came next. Number 9. Enduring aging and illness. After the omen had been read, after the offering had been made, after the healer had mixed herbs, and the family had whispered prayers, there was still one thing no human being in Mesopotamia could escape: the body. Your body could fail you. It could ache after a day in the fields. It could weaken after childbirth, a wound from a bronze blade, a bad tooth, contaminated water, a fever carried by insects, a winter cough that settled deep in the chest. Any one of these could turn an ordinary day into a struggle for survival. And unlike the great temples which could be rebuilt when mud brick walls collapsed, the human body had no easy repair. It wore down. This was one of the clearest boundaries between humans and gods in Mesopotamian religious thought. Not necessarily because every text explains it in the same way, and not because ancient people had one single fixed theology. They did not. Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian and Assyrian traditions changed across thousands of years. But again and again, human beings appear as fragile creatures, creatures who grow tired, suffer pain, become ill, and watch their strength disappear. A god might demand food from the temple kitchen. A god might receive clothing, music, incense, fine oils, and precious metals. But it was human hands that trembled as they carried those offerings, human backs that bent, human eyes that dimmed. Think about life in an ancient Mesopotamian city. The streets could be crowded, narrow and dusty. Houses were built from mud brick. Animals lived close to people. Waste disposal was imperfect. Clean water could be difficult to secure. During flood season, the rivers that gave life to the land could also spread danger through canals, fields, and settlements. The Tigris and Euphrates made civilization possible, but they did not make life safe. A farmer could spend years learning how to guide water across a field, only to be struck down by an infection from a small cut. A weaver could work by lamplight, fingers moving patiently through wool until pain stiffened her hands. A soldier could survive battle and return home carrying an injury that never healed properly. A child could seem healthy one week and be gone the next. For us, illness often arrives with a name: pneumonia, malaria, dysentery, arthritis, heart disease. For ancient Mesopotamians, some sicknesses may have been recognized by recurring symptoms, but their causes remained hidden. And when the cause is hidden, the world can feel full of invisible enemies. Was the fever the work of a hostile spirit? Had a god been offended? Had someone used sorcery? Was this simply a dangerous force wandering through the world looking for a body to enter? The answers could vary. Mesopotamian healing was not one simple system. There were practitioners who prepared remedies from plants, minerals, oils, beer, milk, animal products, and other materials. There were also ritual specialists who used spoken formulas, purifications, figurines, amulets, and prayers to confront the supernatural dimension of sickness. Sometimes both approaches were used together, because why choose only herbs if the problem might also be a demon? Why trust only a ritual if the patient was burning with fever and needed water, rest, bandages, and medicine? This is not as alien as it first sounds, even now, when people face serious illness. They often want more than a diagnosis. They want meaning. They want reassurance. They want someone to tell them why this happened, whether they are to blame, and whether there is still hope. Ancient Mesopotamians wanted those things too. If you're drawn to the unanswered side of the ancient world, there is also a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description, but for most people, sickness was not an abstract mystery. It was immediate. It was a mother sitting beside a child through the night. It was an old man unable to rise from his sleeping mat. It was a labourer calculating whether he could still earn his grain ration with a body that no longer did what it once had. And aging may have been the quietest illness of all. There was no single morning when a person became old. There was just the gradual accumulation of losses. The knees that hurt after walking, the teeth that made hard bread difficult to chew, the eyesight that could no longer follow fine marks on a clay tablet, the hands that remembered a craft perfectly, but lacked the strength to perform it. In a world dependent on physical labour, that decline carried real fear. Your value to a household could depend on what you could produce. Grain had to be ground, wool had to be spun, bricks had to be carried, canals had to be cleared, children had to be fed. When strength faded, a person became more dependent on others at exactly the moment they may have wished most to remain useful. And this is where the ancient contrast becomes almost painfully clear. Humans did not merely think about weakness, they lived inside it. Every scar, every fever, every difficult birth, every stiffened joint was a reminder that a person could not command the flesh to obey forever. The body was not a faithful servant. It was a temporary shelter, vulnerable to heat, hunger, infection, accident, and time. Still, Mesopotamians did not simply surrender. They searched for cures. They called healers. They appealed to gods. They used remedies passed down through generations. They wrote down symptoms and treatments on clay tablets, trying to turn suffering into knowledge. And some of those tablets reveal just how closely they watched the sick body. They recorded fevers, swellings, pains in the head, pains in the belly, wounds that would not close, limbs that had become weak, eyes that no longer saw clearly. They observed what happened on different days. They compared symptoms. They prescribed mixtures and rituals. In some cases, the tablets even sound almost clinical, carefully distinguishing one kind of suffering from another. But knowledge did not make a person immortal. It might help. It might ease pain. It might save a life. It could not erase the final boundary. In Mesopotamian thought, The gods stood on the other side of that boundary. They were imagined as enduring beings, beings who did not pass through the ordinary human cycle of birth, aging, weakness and death. They could be angry, they could be deceived. In myths, they could even be threatened, defeated, or forced to make compromises. Mesopotamian gods were not always presented as all-powerful in the later philosophical sense. But they were deathless. They did not grow old because their joints had failed. They did not lie awake worrying that a cough would become fatal. They did not watch their hair turn grey and understand that time was taking something that would not return. Humans did, and that difference mattered because it explained, in religious terms, why the world was arranged as it was. The gods received worship generation after generation because they remained. Kings died, priests died, workers died. Entire dynasties could vanish into broken walls and dust. But the great gods of the city, at least in the imagination of those who served them, endured beyond the changing human faces. A person might spend 60 years carrying baskets, tending sheep, making bricks, grinding grain, raising children and bringing offerings to a temple. Then that person would be gone. Their children might continue the work. Then their children would be gone too. But Enlil was still Enlil. Inanna was still Inanna. Enki was still Enki. The names could be spoken by people who had never met the generations that spoke them first. That is a strange kind of power. Not the power to strike someone with lightning or flood a city or send a plague. The power simply to remain when everyone else disappears. And nowhere is the human longing for that power clearer than in the story of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh begins as a king of enormous strength, a figure described as partly divine, someone who seems closer to the gods than ordinary people could ever be. He defeats monsters. He travels to distant lands. He seeks fame so great that his name will outlive his body. But then his friend Enkidu dies, and suddenly all his strength means very little. Gilgamesh sees the body of someone he loves becoming still. He sees that even a mighty companion, even a man who fought beside him against monsters, can be taken by death. And he understands something terrible. If Enkidu can die, then Gilgamesh can die too. The rest of the story becomes a desperate refusal to accept that fact. He leaves the city. He crosses wilderness and mountains. He travels through darkness. He seeks out Utnapishtim, the distant survivor of the Great Flood, a man who, in the Babylonian version of the tradition, received an extraordinary gift from the gods, life without end. Not because he earned it through strength, not because he discovered a medicine, because the gods made a unique exception. That detail is important. Utnapishtim is not proof that humans could normally become immortal. He is proof of the opposite. He is the one exception so remote and so difficult to reach that his story emphasizes how closed the door is for everyone else. Gilgamesh wants the secret. He wants to know how to escape the fate built into human life. But the answer he receives is brutal. Sleep itself defeats him. If he cannot stay awake for a few days, how can he hope to overcome death forever? It is one of the oldest and most unsettling arguments in literature. You cannot conquer death, Gilgamesh is told, when you cannot even conquer sleep. Later, he finds a plant said to restore youth. For a moment, it seems that he may have won something. Not full immortality, perhaps, but a way to reverse the slow theft of age. Then a serpent takes the plant while Gilgamesh is bathing. The serpent sheds its skin and renews itself. Gilgamesh returns home empty-handed. No eternal life, no restored youth, no final victory over the body. Just a city, its walls, its temples, its baked bricks, the work of human hands, and perhaps that is the answer the story finally offers. A person cannot become deathless like a god, but a person can build, remember, teach, create, and leave something behind that survives for a while after the body is gone. For Mesopotamians, this did not necessarily make death less frightening. Their underworld was often imagined as a dim and dusty place, not a bright reward for the righteous. The dead needed offerings from descendants. They needed names to be remembered. They needed the living, but it gave human mortality a kind of meaning. The gods endured because they were gods. Humans endured differently. In families, in stories, in temples repaired by new hands, in fields planted by children and grandchildren, in names pressed into clay, surviving long after the fingers that shaped the signs had turned to dust. That was the bitter contrast at the heart of it. No human could simply command sickness to leave, command age to reverse, or command death to pass them by. The deathless gods in Mesopotamian imagination belonged to a different order of existence. But humans had one answer the gods did not need. They had to care for one another while time was still theirs. Number 10. Entering the underworld of Ker. This is where the difference between humans and gods became almost impossible to miss. A human being could grow old. A human being could fall sick. A human being could die, and after death, according to many Sumerian and later Mesopotamian ideas, that person did not simply vanish. They went somewhere. They went down. The Sumerians used the word Ker in several ways. It could refer to mountains, to distant foreign lands beyond the familiar river plains, and, in religious language, to the world beneath the earth where the dead were gathered. The meanings may seem disconnected at first, but imagine living in the flat lands of southern Mesopotamia, where the horizon is broad, rivers wind through reeds, and mountains are distant, strange places at the edge of the known world. Ker meant what was beyond ordinary human reach. A place outside the warm, cultivated landscape of fields, houses, canals, and city walls, and eventually it became one of the names for the land of the dead. Not heaven, not a shining kingdom where the good were rewarded and the wicked were punished according to a simple moral scorecard. That is not usually what the surviving Mesopotamian texts describe. Ker, or the netherworld, was more shadowy than that. More universal, more final. Everyone went there. The king went there. The farmer went there. The priest who spent his life dressing the god's statue in fine wool went there. The labourer who carried mud bricks beneath the burning sun went there. The child who died too young, the warrior killed far from home, the old woman whose grandchildren had forgotten the sound of her voice. All of them, in the broad religious imagination of ancient Mesopotamia, were headed toward the same dark destination. That was something no god had to do in the ordinary human way. The gods could receive offerings in temples. They could be invoked in prayers. They could rule cities through their divine authority, at least in the stories people told. Humans, meanwhile, were temporary visitors in the world above. They walked the streets, harvested grain, raised children, argued with neighbours, worried about debts, and then, sooner or later, they joined the dead below. Picture what that meant emotionally. You live in a crowded city of mud brick and baked clay. Every day you see reminders that life depends on fragile things. The river can fail. A wall can collapse. A fever can take hold. A harvest can be ruined by salt in the soil or insects in the fields. You know people who were alive last year and are now gone. And where are they? Not gone into nothing, perhaps, but gone down into Ker. The dead were often imagined as continuing in some diminished form. They were shades, ghosts, ancestral beings who still had needs. The exact details varied across centuries, cities, and texts. Sumerian religion was never one neat, unchanging system with a single official map of the next world. We are dealing with fragments, hymns, laments, incantations and stories, copied and recopied over thousands of years. But the pattern is clear enough. Death did not necessarily end existence. It changed it. The person who had eaten bread, drunk beer, worked a field and slept beneath a roof became an inhabitant of a world cut off from sunlight, a world often associated with dust, silence, gates, and separation from the living. There is something almost administrative about it. Mesopotamian culture loved lists, boundaries, records, gates, offices, and proper procedures. The universe itself could feel like a vast institution. The city had officials, the temple had storehouses, the palace had workers and rations, and the dead had a place assigned to them too. Kher was not an escape from the system, it was the final destination within it. If you enjoy these old mysteries, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website, with the link in the description. And few mysteries are older or more personal than the question these tablets keep circling without ever fully solving. What exactly becomes of a person after the breath stops? For the Sumerians, the answer was not especially comforting. The underworld was not usually described as a place of green fields and endless feasting. It was a dim continuation. The dead were separated from the ordinary pleasures of life above. In some traditions, dust becomes their food, or at least the image used to describe their bleak condition. Think about that. In life, bread and beer were the foundation of survival. Grain was wages. Grain was ritual offering. Grain was the difference between security and hunger. But below, the dead were imagined in a realm where the abundance of the living world no longer reached them directly, unless someone remembered them. That detail changes everything. Because if the dead continued in Kher, then the living had responsibilities that did not end at the grave. A dead person was not merely a memory. They remained part of the family, part of the household, part of the invisible chain connecting generations. And that meant death was not just a private event. It was a social problem. A person could not carry food into Kher with their own hands. They could not climb back to their house and ask for a cup of water. They depended on those still alive above the ground. Their children, their grandchildren, their relatives, anyone who still knew their name. So entering Kher was one of the most human things imaginable. It was unavoidable, it was lonely, it placed the dead beyond the reach of ordinary work and ordinary speech. But it also created a strange bond between the worlds, because the people below still needed something from the people above. And this is where the stories make one important exception. Gods did not normally die and descend to Kher as helpless human shades. They had temples above ground. They had priests, offerings, festivals, names spoken daily in cities that belonged to them. Their existence was not tied to a single mortal body that could weaken, fail, and be carried away for burial. But sometimes in the oldest stories, a god went down anyway. Not because death had claimed them, because they chose to cross the boundary. And the most famous of these journeys belongs to Inanna. Inanna was no minor figure. She was a goddess of love, sexual power, warfare, kingship, and the unpredictable force of desire. Later, Mesopotamians would know her as Ishtar. She was associated with the bright planet Venus, appearing in the morning and evening sky. She was powerful, glamorous, dangerous, and impossible to reduce to one simple role. Then one day, according to the Sumerian poem, usually called Inanna's Descent, she decided to go below. The reason is not completely clear. Ancient stories do not always explain motivation the way modern stories do. Inanna may have been going to attend the funeral rites of Gugalanna, the bull of heaven. She may have been seeking power in the realm ruled by her sister, Ereshkigal. She may have been making a move so bold that even the other gods would understand its danger. Whatever the reason, she prepared herself carefully. She put on her royal garments, her crown, her beads, her breastplate, her cosmetics, the signs of divine authority, beauty and status. Everything that made Inanna, Inanna in the world above. Then she approached the gates of the Underworld, and this is where the story becomes almost painfully precise. The Underworld had 7 gates. At each gate, the gatekeeper took away one piece of her clothing or regalia. Her crown at one gate, her jewellery at another, her robe, her symbols of office. One by one, she was stripped of the things that gave her power. She protested. The gatekeeper gave the same answer each time. The ways of the Underworld were perfect. The rules could not be questioned. That is remarkable. Even a great goddess could not simply arrive in Kher, announce herself, and ignore its procedures. Inanna had crossed into a realm with its own ruler, its own laws, its own gates, and its own terrifying logic. By the time she reached Ereshkigal, she stood naked and exposed. Then the judges of the Underworld looked upon her. Ereshkigal fixed the eye of death on her. Inanna was struck down. The poem says she became a corpse, hung from a hook like a piece of meat. It is one of the most startling images in ancient literature. The goddess of life, desire, fertility, and brilliant celestial power, suspended in the dark below. For 3 days and 3 nights she remained there. Now, this was not an ordinary human death. That difference matters. Inanna had planned ahead. Before leaving, she instructed her faithful servant Ninshubur to seek help if she did not return. Ninshubur went to the great gods, begging them to intervene. Some refused. The Underworld was not a place where divine decisions could be casually overturned. But Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, found a way. He created 2 strange little beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails. They were neither fully male nor fully female, and they could pass through boundaries that trapped others. Carrying food and water of life, they entered the Underworld and found Ereshkigal in agony, groaning like a woman in labour. Instead of challenging her, they echoed her pain. "You hurt," they said. "Yes," Ereshkigal answered. "I hurt." For the first time, someone below listened to the Queen of the Dead. In gratitude, Ereshkigal offered them a gift. They asked for Inanna's body. They gave her the food and water of life, and Inanna rose. But even then, she could not simply walk free. The Underworld does not release its dead without payment. Inanna was allowed to return only if she provided someone else to take her place. Demons followed her upward, searching for a substitute. The story eventually turns toward Dumuzi, Inanna's husband, whose fate became connected with seasonal cycles, mourning rituals, and the movement between worlds. The details vary in different surviving texts. Ancient Mesopotamian mythology was not one fixed script, but the central idea remains powerful. A deity could enter the Underworld. A deity might even return. Yet the journey was exceptional, dangerous, and governed by rules older than any one god's wishes. That is the contrast hiding beneath the dramatic story. Humans entered Kher because they had no choice. Inanna entered because she dared to. Humans had no Ninshubur waiting above with instructions. No Enki sending magical rescuers. No divine food of life to reverse the final sentence. They could be mourned, remembered, supplied through family rites, and spoken of by descendants. But they could not expect to return to the sunlight. Even the gods treated the boundary with caution, and perhaps that is why the descent of Inanna mattered so much. It did not erase the human fear of death. It made that fear visible. If the Queen of Heaven could be stripped at 7 gates, judged, killed, and held below, then Kher was not a place anyone could take lightly. For ordinary people, the question was never whether they would go down. It was whether anyone above would still remember them when they were gone. 11. receiving care from descendants. For a Sumerian person, death did not end every need. The body was buried, the mourners went home, the noise of grief faded from the courtyard. But somewhere beneath the earth, in the dusty country of Kir, the dead person continued as a gidim, a shade. Not alive in the old sense, not walking beneath the sun, working a field, eating fresh bread, or drinking cold water from a cup, but not simply nothing either. And that created a problem. What did a shade eat? What did it drink? The answer, in the Sumerian imagination, was both simple and unsettling. It received what living people sent below, food offerings, drink offerings, small acts performed at graves, tombs, or household places of remembrance. Bread, beer, water, sometimes perhaps dates, oil, meat, or other provisions depending on the family's resources and the occasion. The exact details changed across centuries, cities, and languages. Sumerian religion was never one single frozen system. We are dealing with fragments, tablets, prayers, legal documents, burial remains, and later Mesopotamian texts that preserve traditions older than themselves. But the basic pattern is clear enough. The dead depended on the living. Picture a burial beneath the floor of a house. That may sound strange to us, but in ancient Mesopotamia, many people were buried close to home. Archaeologists have found graves beneath domestic rooms, courtyards, and thresholds in some settlements. Not every burial looked the same. Some were in jars, some in simple pits, some in larger tombs. Wealthier people might have more elaborate burials. Poorer people had less. As always, death did not erase social difference. But burying a person near the household meant the boundary between the living and the dead was not pushed far away. It was right there, under the floor where people slept, under the courtyard where children played, beneath the room where bread was baked, wool was spun, contracts were argued over, and evening meals were shared. The dead had gone to Kir, yet part of their presence remained anchored to the family home. And then came the offerings, a cup of water poured out, a little beer, a portion of food placed where it could symbolically reach the one below. To modern ears, it can sound like a gesture made for comfort, a ritual way of saying goodbye, but in Mesopotamian thought, offerings could carry a much sharper edge. The dead were not only mourned, they were supplied, because Kir was not imagined as a shining paradise. It was a dim, dusty place. In some texts, its inhabitants eat dust and clay. They wear feathers like birds. They sit in darkness, separated from the warmth and abundance of ordinary life. A person who had been a farmer, merchant, mother, soldier, scribe, or ruler above ground became one more shade in the vast population below. And if no food or water came down, then the condition of the dead could become worse. Later Mesopotamian texts, especially those written in Akkadian, speak very directly about this. A dead person with no one to provide funerary offerings might suffer hunger and thirst. They might wander, they might become restless, they might even trouble the living. We have to be careful here, because later Babylonian and Assyrian sources are not identical to the earliest Sumerian world. Still, they reveal a long Mesopotamian concern. The dead required care, and neglected dead could become dangerous. It is a grimly practical picture of the afterlife. No golden palace, no eternal feast automatically prepared by the gods. No guarantee that a divine hand would notice whether a forgotten person had a drink. The gods had their temples. Their statues were washed, dressed, fed, honoured with music and sacrifice. Cities organised entire workforces to maintain divine households. But an ordinary dead human being had a different arrangement. Their survival below depended on offerings sent from above. That is the strange contrast behind this list entry. In the religious logic of ancient Sumer, a god did not need to wait helplessly for descendants to pour water into the earth. Gods received offerings because they were gods, because temples existed to serve them, because priests and rulers maintained their cults. A human shade, by contrast, could need the smallest gift from the world it had lost. A little water, a little beer, a piece of bread, and that may be why water mattered so much. In a hot land shaped by rivers, canals, drought, and irrigation, water was never merely water. It was life held in a jar. It was the difference between a green field and cracked mud, between a herd surviving summer and collapsing beside a dry channel. To pour water for the dead was to send the one thing no shade could draw for itself from the dark ground of Kür. There is something almost heartbreaking about that. A person spends a lifetime carrying water, digging canals, harvesting grain, paying dues, raising children, serving gods, and enduring illness. Then death takes away their hands. They cannot lift a cup. They cannot grind flour. They cannot walk to the riverbank. Someone above must do it for them. And perhaps this is where funerary offerings became more than supplies. They became a bridge across the hardest divide imaginable. The living could not bring the dead back. They could not open the 7 gates of Kür. They could not give a corpse Enki's water of life. But they could pour a drink into the earth. They could set aside food. They could perform the rites that said, in effect, you are gone, but you are not entirely beyond reach. And somewhere in the middle of all these ancient mysteries, if you enjoy these questions of death, gods, forgotten rituals, and what old civilizations believed was hiding beneath ordinary life, there is a book about 12 unexplained mysteries available on the website. The link is in the description. Now, not every offering was grand. Most people in Sumer were not kings with rich tombs and servants. They were labourers, farmers, craft workers, fishermen, herders and families living close to subsistence. Their gifts to the dead may often have been modest. A small portion taken from a difficult meal, a cup of beer that had to be brewed from hard-earned grain, water carried from a canal or well, which makes the offering more meaningful, not less. Because giving food to the dead meant giving up food the living could have used. And that raises an even deeper question. Who was expected to keep giving after the burial was over? The answer was family, more specifically descendants. A son, a daughter, an adopted heir, a surviving spouse, a brother, a nephew, someone who could remember the name of the dead person and accept the obligation of care. In later Mesopotamian legal and religious traditions, this duty becomes especially clear. Having children was not only about labour, inheritance, or carrying on a household. It was also protection against being forgotten after death. To die without descendants was frightening, for reasons that went far beyond loneliness. It meant there might be nobody left with a reason to speak your name, nobody to maintain the connection between your household above ground and your shadow below it, nobody to remember where you belonged. This is one of those places where the ancient world feels unexpectedly close. People today worry about whether they will be remembered, whether their work mattered, whether anyone will tell their story after they are gone. But in ancient Mesopotamia, memory was not simply emotional. It had consequences. To be remembered was, in a sense, to remain part of the human community. To be forgotten was to lose that last fragile thread. And so the family became more than a group of people sharing a roof, fields, livestock, and grain stores. It became a chain extending through time. The living inherited property, debts, skills, names, and social obligations from those who came before them. But they also inherited responsibility. A household was not just made of the people currently sitting around the fire. It included the dead beneath the floor, The grandparents whose names were still spoken, the parents whose labour had built the house, cleared the field, arranged the marriage, or paid the dues that kept the family from collapse. The dead had made the living possible. Now the living owed them something in return. Think about how powerful that idea is in a world without modern institutions. No pension, no nursing home, no state record keeping that guarantees your identity will survive. A person's place in society rested heavily on family memory. Who was your father? Whose land did you inherit? Which ancestors linked you to this neighbourhood, this profession, this claim on a field or canal allotment? Remembering the dead was not just sentiment, it was proof. Proof that you belonged somewhere. Proof that the house had a history. Proof that the people living there had roots deeper than the present harvest. This may help explain why adoption mattered so much in Mesopotamian society. Adoption was not always about rescuing a child in the modern sense. It could create an heir where no biological heir existed. It could secure property, labour, old age support and continuity. Some legal texts from Mesopotamia show adopted children taking on serious obligations toward adoptive parents. The exact rules differed by period and city, of course. Sumer lasted across many centuries, and later Akkadian-speaking societies developed their own legal customs. But the underlying anxiety is visible. A person needed someone after them, someone to carry the household forward, someone to make sure their name did not vanish into the dust. And that brings us back to the strange contrast between humans and gods. The gods of Sumer had eternal names: Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Utu, Nanna. Their names were written on tablets, sung in hymns, carved into bricks, repeated by priests, kings, scribes, and entire cities. Even when one city fell, another could preserve the god's cult. Divine memory was built into the machinery of civilization. But an ordinary human being had no such guarantee. A farmer might work for 50 years, raise children, repair canals, survive droughts, pay temple dues, and die with almost nothing written down. If the family line ended, if the house collapsed, if the descendants moved away or forgot, that person's name could disappear completely. No god had to fear that particular kind of silence. A god might lose a temple, a city, or a kingdom. Ancient Mesopotamian texts are full of gods abandoning ruined sanctuaries and angry deities allowing cities to fall. But a god was not dependent on a grandson remembering a face he had never seen. A human was. That is what makes ancestor care so deeply human in the Sumerian religious imagination. It was an exchange across generations. Parents cared for children when they were helpless. Children grew up and took their place in the household. Then, when the parents became old, they might depend on those children again. And after death, the dependence continued in another form. The relationship did not end. It changed direction. The old cared for the young. Then, the young cared for the old. Then the living cared for the dead. And eventually, if the chain held, the dead would become ancestors. Not powerful gods floating above the world, but remembered members of a family, held in place by names, duties, stories, and ritual attention. Of course, we should not imagine every Sumerian household following one perfect system. The evidence is incomplete. Families broke apart, children died, wars scattered communities, floods destroyed houses, poverty made every obligation harder. Many dead people surely received less care than tradition demanded. Ancient ideals and ancient reality were never exactly the same. But the ideal itself tells us something important. To be human was to need others not only at birth, not only in sickness, not only in old age, but even after death. The Sumerian gods could be served by vast temples and permanent priesthoods. Their presence was maintained by cities. But the mortal dead depended on something smaller and more vulnerable, a family that remembered, a descendant who accepted the duty, a name spoken one more time in a house that still stood above the earth. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden inside this strange Sumerian contrast. The gods were powerful. They commanded storms, guarded cities, received offerings, and decided the fates of kings. But in the stories, hymns, and temple traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, they were not expected to do the things that filled an ordinary human life. They did not bend over fields with a hoe, waiting for grain to rise from difficult soil. They did not stand waist-deep in muddy canal water, clearing reeds and silt before the next flood season. They did not haul bricks beneath the heat of the southern sun, building walls, temples, storehouses, and houses that might outlive them by only a few generations. Humans did that. The gods received the harvest, humans made the harvest possible. Humans prepared the divine meals, washed and dressed the sacred statues, paid the dues that kept temples and palaces operating, and accepted grain rations in return for work that could be exhausting, dangerous, and uncertain. In the Sumerian imagination, civilization did not simply appear because the gods wished it into existence. It had to be maintained day after day by people. And then there were the things no offering could solve: aging, illness, weakness, the slow realization that a body which once carried mud bricks, swung a tool, or walked behind a plough would not remain strong forever. The gods could be imagined as ageless and radiant, but humans lived inside time. They were born helpless, grew strong for a while, and eventually declined. Then came Kur, the land below the earth. Not necessarily a place of dramatic punishment, at least not in the earliest Sumerian material, but a shadowy destination that even heroes could not simply avoid. Mortals entered it. Mortals needed descendants above ground to remember them, to care for their names, and to preserve that fragile link between the dead and the living. That may be the most human thing of all. Not power, not immortality, dependence. A human being needed rain, grain, canals, neighbours, kin, workers, healers, scribes, and children. They needed a community while they lived, and according to the traditions that survived on clay tablets, they needed memory after they died. So when we say these were things that no god can do, we should be careful. This is not a universal claim about every religion or every god ever imagined. It is a contrast shaped by Sumerian religious thought and by the particular world of ancient southern Mesopotamia. The evidence is incomplete. The texts come from different centuries, and no single tablet gives us a perfect picture of what every person believed. But the pattern is still there. The gods were above the ordinary burdens of mortality. Humans were not, and somehow that was not merely a weakness. It was what made human life meaningful. A god might possess divine authority, but a person could cultivate a field for their family, repair a canal for a city, care for an aging parent, teach a child a skill, leave behind a name that someone, somewhere might continue to speak. Maybe that is why these ancient tablets still feel so close. They are not only records of distant gods, they are records of tired workers, anxious families, hungry households, sick bodies, inherited duties, and people trying to make sure that tomorrow would be possible. If this journey through the Sumerian world gave you something to think about, kindly take a moment to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more quiet journeys into ancient history. And tell us again, where are you listening from tonight? If you would like to go deeper, there is also a book on 12 unexplained mysteries available through the website, with the link in the description. And the very best support for this channel is listening on Spotify. The Spotify link is waiting for you in the description as well. For now, let the canals grow still, let the temple doors close, and let the names of the ancient dead rest softly in the dark.